There are a ton of huge combat mistakes you can make in Clair Obscur Expedition 33, and a ton of different mechanics between a lot of different characters that can make you super powerful if you really know how to actually use all of them. This should cover basically everything to make sure you have no questions about combat ever again. You'll inevitably see characters that you get later on in the story, so if you don't want to see any of those characters or spoilers, save this video and come back later. Now first, one of the biggest overlooked things in a lot of these fights, especially against a bunch of harder enemies and bosses, is specifically the break meter and how it works. Each enemy essentially has a meter below their health, which you can see either pulses if it's full, or just simply has a gold meter. You can also see the star right there, meaning that the enemy's break meter is completely full, meaning certain skills will actually break that enemy's guard, and you can see that on the skill itself. For instance, our Phantom Star skill for Virgo and Perfect Break as well can break with that same star icon the enemy if the enemy's break bar is full. And by breaking an enemy, you essentially stun them and deal a lot more damage, and this can significantly increase the amount of damage that we do. To deal tons of damage, ideally we want to get an enemy's break meter completely full, and then use a skill that will break them, which again results in a lot more damage. Also, when it comes to filling an enemy's break bar faster, high damage singular hits affect the break bar much more than individual smaller hits. Meaning you can fill the break bar faster by doing huge one-hit combos that deal lots of damage. You can see if we use our Perfect Break skill, you can see not only are we going to deal a bunch of damage, but we're also going to break that enemy. That essentially means they'll be stunned for a turn, meaning basically the turn can go right back to us to begin attacking them. You should definitely keep a focus on that break bar for the enemy, because if they're able to be broken, you want to make sure someone in your party has at least a break ability. That way, again, you can stun them and deal a lot more damage. Next, even though you already know how to dodge and parry, I'm going to go over it because there's a couple things specifically with dodging and parrying that you may not know. For instance, if you parry, the timing specifically is right as the hit happens, so you might actually have to parry and learn to time your parry a little bit later than you might think. Dodging is essentially the exact same way, but it's ultimately a little more forgiving. Essentially, for the most part, you should almost always parry, because when you parry, you actually gain an action point for every character that successfully parries an enemy, meaning if your entire party parries a party-wide attack, basically you should focus primarily on parrying for the most part versus dodging. The only real difference is dodging has a little bit more of an effective time window, so you have a little bit more variation in the amount of times that you can successfully dodge. Parrying has a little bit smaller of a time window, meaning it's a little harder to parry, and you may actually have to parry a little bit later than you might think. You basically need to parry at the exact moment the hit is hitting you in order to actually successfully parry. So ideally you want to learn these enemies' attack types so that way you can successfully parry all of your hits versus dodging them. And a good gauge for this is if you're able to only dodge an enemy hit but actually perform a perfect dodge, that means that you should be about ready to parry. If you're struggling with this, simply go into a fight, and all you have to do is skip your turn and practice your parrying to learn the timing until you get it down fully. Additionally, as you level up, there are certain pictos that can actually boost your overall dodging and parrying. Specifically, pictos that you can find like the Energizing Parry pictos can actually give you an additional AP on successful parry, meaning if we stack that with the original AP we can actually get a lot of free action points just from parrying alone. Whereas pictos like Dodger actually allow us to gain an AP on a perfect dodge once per turn. But again, if you're already going to get a perfect dodge, instead of that, you can focus on parrying. That way you can get +1 AP automatically. And mastering the parry timing is one of the biggest mechanics in the game for making sure you don't lose a bunch of these fights. Next, I want to go over the status effects because some of them are actually very OP, whether they're used on enemies or against you. Status effects like burn, you can stack incredibly fast from characters like Lune or others, and the burn effect actually deals damage at the beginning of the character's turn, and you can stack multiple stacks of burn on any individual enemy. Now the thing is, when you stack multiple sources of burn on an enemy, it actually increases the amount of burn damage that's received by that enemy, so that if you can manage to stack 10 or 15 stacks of burn on an enemy, you can essentially bump up the amount of damage that you're doing for free every single turn by a lot. Not only that, but you can freeze enemies. That actually prevents the character from playing for multiple turns in a row, which is essentially equivalent to a stun, but frozen is actually removed when the character takes damage. But again, it keeps them from attacking from a certain amount of time. Stun obviously prevents the character from playing, and that can happen through a bunch of different things, such as if you are to break an enemy by maxing out their break bar and using a break skill, or an enemy does the same to you, essentially stunning you and making it skip your turn. Status effects like inverted actually prevent the character from being healed And if the character actually gets healed while inverted, it actually takes damage instead. The mark status effect, which can be used by some characters' abilities early in the game, actually increases the next damage received by that character by 50%, and it only affects one specific instance of damage. So ideally, you could mark an enemy in preparation for one character's gigantic hit, and then that huge hit would then go up by an additional 50%. So you can specifically mark an enemy, even skip characters' turns if you need to, until you hit with the big attack you're waiting for from one of your different characters in your party. The charm effect actually prevents the character from playing, and instead actually make the character attack one of your own allies. The blight skill specifically reduces the max health of your character, and it's possible to be affected by multiple instances of blight, which means each time you get a stack of blight, it reduces your max health by 10%. And by taking off a lot of your max health, this can really hurt, meaning you really need to dodge or parry those specific abilities. We also have Berserk that increases the character's damage every single turn, and it can be accumulated up to 12 times and increase their damage with each individual stack. Now, Cursed actually kills the character at the end of its duration. Bound actually prevents the character from dodging entirely, meaning you'll need to be relying on parrying. Specifically, Exhausted prevents your character from actually gaining AP from any single source, and you'll have to wait until Exhausted wears off to actually regain some of your AP. Meaning you may only be limited to specific basic attacks. Additionally, Dizzy makes it harder for your character to aim, meaning you can miss some of your actual attacks. Silence can actually be put on you from a bunch of different enemies in the game. It actually prevents your character from using any skills whatsoever. And then Rage makes the character play twice in a row. Now, there are a lot of different status effects, not to mention there are a million Pictos like Burning Death, where you apply 3 burn to all enemies on death, Burning Shots, where you get a 20% chance to burn on your free aim shot, or even things like Breaking Burn, where you get 25% increased break damage on burning enemies, or Critical Burn, where you get 25% increased critical chance on burning enemies. Burn is a primary status effect in Expedition 33 and can deal tons of damage, especially when paired with the right Pictos. Next, all of our different characters obviously have a ton of different abilities, and there are 3 main types of abilities that you want to make sure you have on pretty much every party member, period. These 3 types are single target damage abilities, multiple target damage skills, and healing skills. For instance, Sael has a healing ability, which you should have in at least one member of your party, that can heal basically your entire party at once. Grim Harvest actually deals medium single target dark damage, but heals all of your allies by 30% health and can consume the foretell that she puts on enemies to heal by an additional 5% increased. When pairing that skill with a weapon like this, where on level 4 your stun skills always apply 10 foretell, this means if you stack 10 foretell on an enemy with 1 hit and then use this to heal your entire team, you're healing your entire team by 80% health just from that alone, pretty much instantaneously. Again, each character should also have an ability that can deal damage to all enemies at once. So for instance, again, Sael has the Dark Wave ability that deals high dark damage to all enemies and can even be upgraded again, consuming additional foretell for increased damage. Again, having something this like Lune by using Wildfire, where you deal fire damage and stacks of burn to all enemies, Fire Rage, where you can deal again high fire damage to every enemy on the screen, or even this last ability can help us hit multiple enemies at once with really high damage. And finally, your single target damage abilities. Again, I'll use Sael as an example here, but having something like Final Path would let us do extreme amounts of single target dark damage that can also apply foretell and break enemies. And even though this costs a ton of AP, we should always have an ability like this, especially for harder or individual boss fights, because some of these characters can stack up AP very quickly, and you can be at the maximum of 9 AP, sometimes before you even blink, with parrying and a bunch of other Pictos and Luminas activated. You want every character in your party to have at least one very high damage ability. That way, if you happen to stack up a lot of AP during a fight, you can use it to convert straight to pretty high damage attacks. Now, we also need to go over elemental affinities. Specifically, there are a bunch of enemies that have either weaknesses or resistances to different damage types or different elemental damage types, some of which they can even completely nullify or even absorb your damage, meaning they can heal from your actual attack instead of actually taking damage. For instance, certain enemies will have weaknesses to specific elements, whether that's light, dark, fire attacks, ice attacks, meaning they take 50% more damage from them. So understanding which enemies have which weaknesses can literally make fights way easier. The same goes for resistances. You could be attacking an enemy with fire attacks. They might be resistant to fire attacks, meaning they actually take 50% less damage from every skill that you cast. And those will actually pop up when you attack the enemy, so pay attention to which specific elements or weaknesses for that enemy type, and it'll make some of these fights a lot easier. Now, one thing that's confusing is your attack power actually scales with your individual weapon, and some of these weapons actually have different stats on them, even for the same character. For instance, this sword for Virgo actually scales with B in luck and C in vitality. That means the more points we have in luck, the more attack power we'll basically get than having the same amount of points in vitality, but you want to scale both of these stats for your weapon to get the most overall attack power or damage. Now, if we compare that to the sword right above it, it actually scales with a B in defense and a C in luck, basically a completely different stat setup. All of these weapons scale differently with your stats, so focus on upgrading attributes for your characters, specifically based on the overall attributes that you need, and not focusing completely on the scalability of the weapon itself. Because if you get a different weapon, the scaling for the weapon with your attributes might be different, which means again, you should just put points where you need them for your character's stats in general. Keep in mind, if you find a final form weapon that you want to use basically until the end of the game, you can always recoat and reset your attributes to realign them with what the weapon might be if you want to respec your character. Now, one thing about flying enemies specifically will actually dodge a large majority of your primary attacks, and this is where your ranged combat comes in. Essentially, if you hold the left trigger, you can pull out your ranged weapon, and these are enemies that you'll primarily need to shoot in order to basically actually kill. Now, a lot of them will actually have different things flying around them that you can actually shoot and deal large explosion damage to a lot of the enemies around you. But ideally, these enemies are all pretty low health, so I'd mainly focus on just taking them out first and using your ranged weapon and all the AP that your character has to take those enemies out early. Now, another thing you can do while using ranged combat and things like breaking shields, the ranged combat can actually allow you to shoot weak points on the enemy. Certain enemies will have weak points near their head or little glowing areas on their body that you can shoot and actually break or deal additional effects to the enemy to make them take more damage. Also, there's a lot of enemies in the game that can actually generate shields for members of their entire party or themselves. And if they are to generate shields on themselves, essentially they negate completely an entire attack, which is where your ranged combat comes in. You can use your ranged weapon to shoot the shield off of enemies individually. Since your ranged attacks only use 1 AP, this means you can take off enemies' entire sets of shield and then use your skills or basic attack or even skills later from other party members to attack the enemy directly versus wasting your regular attacks or AP by casting skills on enemies with shields that will literally just get nullified. Now, later in the game, it'll also introduce you to gradient attacks and gradient dodges. These are specifically important because once you unlock these, enemies can attack you with gradient attacks. Most of the time that can really hurt or even sometimes kill you in one shot. Now, the way gradient dodges work specifically is when an enemy goes to gradient attack you, time will essentially slow down for a second and the entire screen or attack will glow in gray. Now, the important thing here is this isn't like parry or dodge timing necessarily. In order to do the gradient dodge, you essentially need to hit R2, but you need to make sure you're timing this with the actual hit itself. Because this attack is essentially slowed, you need to wait until right towards the end of the attack where the attack is actually going to hit you, which is basically where you need a gradient dodge. You need to make sure you're gradient dodging these gradient attacks just before the enemy swings or actually hits you versus when the screen overall just flashes gray. That can be confusing, especially early on once you get introduced to the mechanic. Now, gradient attacks, on the other hand, are attacks that you can actually do yourself, most of which can hit multiple enemies at once or deal high amounts of damage to single targets, and many characters in your party can have different types of gradient attacks. For instance, Lune has an earth attack that can hit basically all enemies at once for an extreme amount of damage. Each gradient attack will use one of your gradient charges that you have down at the bottom in order to fill out this bar so you can actually unlock a gradient charge. You actually get points towards this for each action point that you spend with your skills. So as you're using skills throughout a fight, you can build up enough gradient for a gradient attack, which again, depending on which character you use, can deal lots of damage to a single target or even all the enemies on the screen. Another important thing is making sure while you're playing that you're making sure you explore a lot of the different areas, because not only do you get a lot of permanent unlockables, but you also get shards that are actually used to upgrade your potions. Not only to get more potions like you can see down in the bottom right, but also to upgrade the size of them so that way they can be more potent and have much more of an effect. For instance, when you initially first get potions, they'll only heal 35% of your actual health. When you upgrade these, this will eventually go up to, let's say, 65%. And the same goes for your revive and AP potions, meaning you can revive an enemy for 65% health with really only one upgrade to that potion versus reviving an ally at 35% health is a big difference. Not to mention you get your overall potion capacity for additional chroma elixirs, meaning you can have a lot more healing between fights as you progress through the game without having to rest at an expedition flag. So make sure you're looking for these because these really come in handy going from expedition flag to expedition flag. Now, in terms of attributes, because attributes play a lot into your overall combat, things that are really important that might initially be overlooked are things like agility, where it upgrades the speed for your character, and this means you get to play more turns more often. 690 speed versus, let's say, 300 speed could be a difference of playing 2 turns for every 1 turn the enemy plays, meaning you get a lot more overall attacks and can do a lot more overall damage and get attacked a lot less just by having very high agility. Now, Vitality obviously just increases your health pool, and Might is your primary attack power scaler. However, don't overlook Luck, because increases to your critical rate means you could deal 50% more damage with critical hits. Things like critical burn could increase our critical chance on burning enemies with our already high critical chance that we already have with the character, meaning we can almost guarantee a critical hit or that 50% extra damage increase. Not to mention, some Pictos can actually help you chain additional critical attacks, meaning if you get a critical hit, you actually gain an extra attack for free, which you can then chain with a high enough critical rate into tons and tons of extra free attacks without any extra cost. And defense as well, which reduces your overall incoming damage, can be extremely helpful, especially again if paired with the right Pictos. Now, the big thing specifically with parrying and counterattacking is in order to actually counterattack, you have to successfully parry every single attack from an enemy's combo. Meaning if an enemy hits with a 5-hit combo or a 1-hit combo, you have to successfully parry every single attack in that combo chain. If you do that, then you get a counterattack that deals increased damage to the enemy. And again, you can pair that with things like Augmented Counter for increased counterattack damage. And if you have something like that activated here as a Luminous for all of your characters, the upgraded Augmented Counter Pictos for increased counterattack damage. If an enemy does a party-wide attack and you're able to counter them with the entire party, not only does the entire party get a free counterattack on the enemy for massive damage, but they also get augmented counter bonuses for every person on your squad. Now, also something important is buffs and debuffs for your characters and for enemies. So certain skills will give you regen buffs that heal your character by 10% max health at the beginning of their turn. Again, if we use Virgo for an example, we can apply Powerful to every person in our party and increase our damage by 25% for 3 turns. Again, if we have an A rank increase for the specific character, which is another mechanic specifically related to Virgo, it actually increases this to 5 turns. So we get a huge damage buff for 5 turns. But if you pair this with something like the longer Powerful Pictos, on applying Powerful, it actually increases its duration by 2 rounds, meaning you can get a total of 7 rounds just by using the Powerful skill one singular time. So if you stack these correctly, you can get a bunch of extra free damage from it. The Rush bonus actually increases the speed of a character by 33%, meaning they essentially get more turns much more often as long as the Rush ability is activated. Now, Shell actually reduces the damage received by the character by 20%, and Shell can be applied in a number of different ways, but certain Pictos, like the SOS Shell that you can get pretty early on and activate under your Luminous points for characters, helping you to survive a little bit easier. Now, our red debuffs, for instance, are Powerless, which actually reduces the character's damage dealt by 20%, Slow, which reduces the speed of the character by 25%, meaning you get less turns, and then Defenseless, so it actually increases the damage received by the character by 25%. And certain characters can specifically apply Defenseless to enemies to help them take more damage for a certain amount of turns. That being said, those are all the big combat mechanics and things you should know to master the combat in Clair Obscur Expedition 33. If this video helped you out, drop a like on it, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you guys in the next one.